Hello and welcome back to my world of stuff. Today we're travelling back in time, 1953, and we're going to look at a film which is an interesting one because this is one that I remember very well from my education in the world of science fiction films from, as I've mentioned before, those Saturday night double bills we used to have on BBC Two. And then I believe that BBC One or BBC Two later on ran classic science fiction films in an early evening slot. And this is where I watched so many of these films that are so imprinted on my brain and so important in my appreciation and development of science fiction and fantasy as a genre. The film I'm looking at today is very interesting because I have quite strong memories of it, and watching it again now for the first time in donkey's years, I have a slightly different perspective on it, and I picked up on certain things from it which make it actually quite an unusual and revolutionary and ahead of its time film. Let's go back to 1953 and meet the Invaders from Mars. Welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. Yes, Invaders from Mars, 1953, science fiction film directed by William Cameron Menzies and starring Jimmy Hunt, Helena Carter, Arthur Flint, Maurice Ancrum, Leif Erikson and Hilary Brooks. Produced by Edward L. Alperson and released by 20th Century Fox. This is a film I have certain strong memories of. Now, I haven't seen this for ages. As I mentioned, I watched it this week on this Region 1 DVD, which I picked up. Well, it's the 50th anniversary edition, so this came out in the early 2000s. This was released during the big boom of DVD, of course, and I picked this up, Region 1 disc. Fortunately, I can play this on my 4K player, and I'm interested to see that it says at the back, a brand new digital transfer. If this is the brand new digital transfer that was released in 2003, I would hate to see what it looked like before it was digitally transferred because it's a ropey print. It's very washed out. There's lots of discolorations in the print and line that appears through it and flecks and so on. I believe it's now available on Blu-ray or has been available on Blu-ray, and I'll try and pick it up at some point because I would imagine it would look quite interesting with a really good quality transfer. This came out in 1953, and although it predates by a few years the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers, comes out a couple of years after The Thing, what it does, quite eerily, is focus on that core science fiction concept of loss of self, loss of identity, being taken over, being subsumed by an extraterrestrial alien hostile intelligence. This is something which runs through science fiction. It's a very popular thing of possession and bodily corruption and loss of self. And this film does it extremely well in a very disturbing and quite surrealistic way if you watch the film again. The film was released in 1953 and it was a bit of a quickie. It cost less than $300,000 to make, and it was rushed into production because the studio had heard that George Powell was working on his, for the time, big budget adaptation of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, which is, of course, a science fiction classic from that era. So they rushed out a film with Mars in the title, thinking that they would capitalise on this. And although this film isn't of the standard or standing of War of the Worlds, it's actually a very intriguing film in itself, mainly because of its visual look. It's very unusual, austere, expressionistic, I think it's described in the booklet in the DVD that I watched, way of telling the story. In the film, we meet David McLean, played by young Jimmy Hunt. He's a young lad who's keen on astronomy. He's got his telescope set up. He's always gazing out into the heavens, looking out for cosmic phenomena and so on. And he lives with his parents in a fairly remote farmhouse in Nowhereville, USA. One night he witnesses a classic science fiction flying saucer appearing in the sky and dipping down behind a hill just outside his home. He tells his parents about this. They obviously are a bit skeptical. His father goes out to investigate and he walks up the hill towards where his son has said he's seen this flying saucer land. This is an abiding image from this film, and if you've seen the film and forgotten it, this is something you may remember, these iconic, quite chilling sequences, because the film is largely studio bound. There's a hill and there's a little picket fence that goes up the hill and then disappears over the horizon. There's a sort of a sandy area, and this is all lit very well. That's one of the strengths of the film, the way it is lit, and that visual style that it has. And you see people walking up this hill and suddenly disappearing. They're sort of dragged down into the sand. That, I think, is the abiding memory of this film. And I think it's something that most people who've seen this film will recall. That's the one with the hill, the creepy hill with something in the sand. David's father goes to investigate and disappears. The next morning, 2 police arrive to try and find him, to see if they can locate him. They too disappear, but David's father reappears. But there's something not quite right about him. He's behaving coldly. He's very distant. He's very aggressive in a way he hasn't been before. He lashes out at David at one point, and he doesn't seem to be the same man. David notices at the back of his neck a strange little red mark, a little, almost like a blood mark. Soon David notices that a lot of people around him are starting to behave a little strangely, in this strange, detached, robotic fashion. David's mother, his neighbours, others in the vicinity, in the neighbourhood, they all start behaving in this strange, unearthly, unreal way. David makes contact with Dr. Pat Blake, played by Helena Carter, in what was to be, in fact, her last screen role. She takes him to astronomer Dr. Stuart Kelston. David manages to convince Dr. Kelston that what he has witnessed is a flying saucer, and they discover that this is part of an invading vanguard from the planet Mars. What transpires afterwards is a fairly sort of standard science fiction stuff. The army get involved, people keep disappearing and reappearing. The army investigate, the army discover aliens have set up a base underneath the sand, underneath the ground, outside David's home. And a battle ensues with alien creatures, giant sort of mutant creatures rampaging through the tunnels, and this quite eerie, detached, headless thing in a jar which communicates and expresses itself just by moving its eyes around. This is a very interesting and unusual film. I think the first 20-25 minutes are where it's at its strongest in terms of its themes and its narrative, because it does predicate upon that idea of this boy who can't understand what's going on, but he knows, and he instinctively realizes that people around him are being changed. They don't behave in the way that they always have. And that's eerie and unnerving, because we've seen these characters as they were before, ordinary, affable people who suddenly become very machine-like and unemotional. And that's quite chilling and quite eerie. And as I said at the beginning, this is all about that idea of the loss of your identity and being taken over and having your personality wiped. And that, obviously, for David is terrifying, because he's on his own. He's a young boy. How can he persuade adults of something which sounds so irrational and so ridiculous and so outrageous? And I think those parts of the film work really well. I think that first 20-25 minutes has a great atmosphere about it, because it focuses on David. He's running about trying to find somebody who will listen to him, let alone believe him. When he does find somebody who believes him, the story then shifts, as I said, into a slightly more traditional military thing, with the military trying to find and locate the aliens and go into battle with them. So it loses that element of atmosphere and creeping dread and unease that it had, and becomes a bit more generic. Not any less interesting. I mean, this is a very short film. It's about 80 minutes long. And it does barrel along at a good old pace. It's never boring. It becomes, as I said, a bit ordinary and a bit standard for the Invasion Earth genre, with the military and gun battles and racing about in tunnels and things. But what makes the film work is something which, when I watched it, I thought, this looks weird. It's a low-budget film, and there are things about it which made me think, oh, this looks a bit cheap and a bit tacky. And that's probably half the story. Now, I'm talking about this film, and if you've never seen it, I have to talk about it with spoilers. And I can't believe I'm giving a spoiler warning about a film that's over 70 years old. But there are things that happen at the end of the film, which I think may explain what happens earlier in the film. At the end of the film, if you've seen it, you will remember. If you haven't seen it, this is a spoiler, so go away until you've seen the film. At the end of the film, it turns out that it's all been a dream. And David has fantasized all this and imagined it all, because he's a very imaginative and vivid-minded child. Earlier on in the film, there are a lot of scenes which take place in very surreal, minimalistic sets. The first time I noticed this is when David rushes into the local police station, and it's this long, bland corridor where he talks to the police sergeant at the desk, and it's just a desk, and the wall behind him, it almost looks like something done on green screen today, where they haven't put in the background. He's literally sitting at a desk with a completely blank wall behind him, a sort of dark blue or purple wall. And it's very odd, and it's very surreal. And then it cuts across to a senior police officer who's standing in a doorway in a very empty, desolate room, corridor, And he almost looks like a cardboard cutout in the door. And he goes into an office which is quite sparsely furnished. Later on, when he goes to Dr. Kelston's laboratory, you get sort of a laboratory set with the telescope, giant telescope that they look through. And there are one or two scenes when David is there with Dr. Kelston and Dr. Pat Blake, and they're looking through the telescope, and you get this view of them, but there's nothing behind them. Even though we know that they're in this fully furnished room, there's just this purple wall. And there are a few scenes like this, which are very sparse and very underdressed, which you can put down to lack of budget. But I think when you see the whole film and you see the way it plays out, because it is all a dream, could be interpreted, and I think that's the way to look at it. This is David's mind, his dreamscape. He's focusing in his dream on the story. The detail, the background detail of rooms and furnishings and stuff aren't important in his dream story. What's important is what's happening, this invasion thing that's part of his fantasy. So he's not concerned about all the details. He's concerned about the people that he meets and trying to talk to them and explain what's going on, and then getting the military involved. And I think when you look at it that way, because I watched the film and I thought, God, these scenes are really tacky because these sets are empty. But once you've seen the ending and it is all a dream in the American version, then it makes sense. And I think it's actually a very clever idea to offset the lack of budget and to use that device that it's a dream to explain why it looks so sparse and minimalist. And it really works well. It's very unusual and very striking and daring, I think, for the time when films were just starting to sort of get up on the feet and look a bit bigger and bolder and brasher. For a film to do something like this is really very clever indeed. Beyond that, there's some quite dark things that happen in this film. At one point, there's a 9-10-year-old girl who lives next door to the family. She too is taken over by the aliens. It's quite clear that she has lost her personality. Although she's behaving like a child, she's clearly not quite a child. Later on, we discover that this child has died. It's just mentioned casually. She's died. She had a cerebral hemorrhage. It turns out that this is the alien involvement. They put these devices into the backs of people's necks to control them, but at the end of these devices are effectively explosives. And when the humans that they've taken over are no further use to them, they detonate those explosives in people's brains, and it gives the appearance of a cerebral hemorrhage. And you stop and think, hang on, you've killed off a 9-year-old girl off screen. We don't see this happening, but it's referred to that it's happened. And it happens to a couple of other older characters later on. And this is quite dark for a science fiction film, which presumably aimed at a family audience when it was released. And you think, well, that's quite a cold, dark place to go in a science fiction film. It's quite unusual. But beyond that, as I said, the second half of the film not quite as interesting because it is a bit more ordinary, even within the confines of the fact that it's David's dream. You get the military involved, and it just follows the normal sort of traditional route you would expect from this sort of film. Some of the budgetary issues are quite obvious in places. I mean, a lot of the military scenes are composed of stock footage, and there's a lot of stock footage of tanks rolling across the countryside, trains. There's one quite long scene of a couple of soldiers sort of conducting slow maneuvers with a couple of military trucks and lorries and things. There's probably about between 5 and 10 minutes of stock footage in this film, which for a movie that only runs for 79 minutes, it's a bit unusual. But when I finished watching the film, I thought that's not quite as good as I remember. I still was struck by that hillside image, that slope with the fence and the lighting behind it. As I said, the atmospheric lighting throughout the film. And it really works because almost all the exterior scenes are done interior. So obviously they were able to manipulate the lighting for the best effect, and the cinematographer and the camera people really did a good job in creating this weird look. And that's the most striking image, and I will go back to it again and again, is of this hill where this alien sorcerer's landed, and these very scary images of people walking up this hill and suddenly they drop down out of sight because they've been pulled under the sand by the aliens beneath. Very, very unusual stuff. And another very strong component of the film is the musical score. It's a very striking musical score because when the aliens appear and when they're doing something, there is this musical score which is described as outre. It's an ethereal, rhythmically wavering tonal composition, a sort of choral, haunting, heavenly sort of sound, which again adds to the sense of dislocation that the story creates. And that, I think, underpins what David is going through and what's actually happening to the people in the story as they're being taken over. And you tend to hear it when the aliens are doing something. It's an interesting film, and I am sort of torn about whether it's a cheapie that gets by because it's very cleverly made, or it is actually a masterpiece of the genre. It's hard to sort of ignore the fact that it has a low budget look to it, but I think they get around it very well by the fact that it is all a dream. The problem with that is when the film was released the following year in 1954 in the UK distributors didn't like the dream ending. So they demanded that some changes were made. So there were some reshoots, additional scenes were done, and I think some of them are quite obvious because Jimmy Hunt, who played David, looks a bit older by now. He's got different hair and slightly different clothes. But removing the dream ending actually takes away from the surreal look of the film, because if it isn't a dream and if it is a story that you're telling, how does that account for these peculiar backdrops? So I prefer the American cut because even though the "it was all a dream" thing is such a cliche, it probably wasn't back then. It was a fairly new device then, but we've seen films and TV shows that were all a dream. I think there was a whole season of Dallas that was just a dream when somebody who was dead appeared in a shower. So it is a device that we're now over familiar with. But I think back in 1953, it was probably something a bit, oh, that's unusual. Removing it for the British version of the film takes away a lot from the film. So if you're going to watch the film, if you can get hold of it, I think it is still available on DVD and Blu-ray. I think it may be out of print, but you can probably find it on eBay or in secondary markets. If you can find a version that has the American cut, that's the one to go for, because I think that's the one that's the true representation of the story the way it was intended to be done. So I think it's actually a very clever, underrated film. And if you go into it in the right frame of mind, and once you are aware of the end of the film, it does make a lot more sense about the look of the film, which is quite eerie and quite unnerving. And again, that all adds to this sense of loss of humanity, because we seem to be finding ourselves in a world which isn't quite like ours, because there are things not right with it. It's a story in his head about aliens, and he's not concerned with what's on the walls, desks and chairs. He's just concerned with the dynamism of the story, and I think that makes it work very well. It's a very unusual film. If you've never seen Invaders from Mars, it is not one of the better remembered science fiction films, but I do think that people who've seen it do remember it. And as I said, my abiding memory is always that eerie hill. And I've mentioned that several times because it is a very striking image. It was remade in the 1980s. I'm going to track that version down as well to see how it compares. I suspect it won't have quite the same quality, but it might be interesting to see how it looks compared to the original 1953 version. That's Invaders from Mars. If you've seen Invaders from Mars, why not leave a comment down below? Let me know what you think of it. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on the film, your interpretation of its style and its story, and if you think it works as a science fiction film, or do you think the budget undermines it, or do you think the fact that it's all a dream in the American version makes the whole visual look of it make a lot more sense? I do. Right, thank you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe to the channel because there's loads of this stuff. Lots of retro sci-fi films to come, lots of modern films in my Films of the Month. There'll be a new episode of that coming out next week, in fact the week after next. And retro things, books, TV, all sorts of stuff. So stick around, like and subscribe to the channel. I see you soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.